was a cold, dark night when Jake pulled his worn-out truck onto Highway 47. The road stretched endlessly, with nothing but the thin beams of his headlights piercing the surrounding darkness. A storm brewed in the distance, and the occasional rumble of thunder made the silence even more unsettling. Jake was no stranger to late-night drives. He had been a trucker for over 15 years, hauling everything from groceries to steel pipes. But tonight's drive was different. He had taken a detour to avoid a pileup on his usual route, and now he was on a stretch of highway he had never traveled before. The radio crackled as Jake fiddled with the dial trying to find a station. Static filled the cab until a faint voice broke through. "Beware. The highway," the voice whispered, before the station dissolved into static again. Jake frowned and glanced at the radio. "Weird," he muttered, turning it off. He didn't have time for spooky nonsense. His cargo, the sooner he could head home and get some sleep. The miles rolled by, and the storm clouds grew closer. The wind picked up, rattling the truck as if it were trying to peel it off the road. Jake's eyes darted to the side mirrors, catching glimpses of movement in the shadows. But every time he looked directly, there was nothing there. A sign of the dark. Up it read, "Next exit, nowhere, 15 miles. Jake chuckled nervously. Nowhere, huh? Fitting. As he continued, the road began to change. The pavement became cracked, and weeds sprouted through the gaps. The white lines that guided him faded until they disappeared altogether. Jake gripped the steering wheel tighter. His GPS had lost signal miles ago, and his cell phone was as dead as the road. The truck's headlights caught something ahead, a figure standing on the shoulder. Jake slowed, his instincts telling him it wasn't safe to stop, but his conscience wouldn't let him drive past without checking. The figure was a young woman in a tattered dress, her hair matted and wild. Jake rolled down the window slightly. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need a ride?" The woman didn't answer. Instead, she slowly lifted her head. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dark, sending a chill down Jake's spine. "I wouldn't go any farther if I were you," she said, her voice hollow and distant. Turned and vanished into the shadows. He stared at the spot where she had stood, his heart pounding. The storm roared above, lightning illuminating the road for a split second, but the woman was gone. "Get a grip, Jake," he muttered, rolling up the window and pressing on the gas. The road grew rougher, and the truck began to shudder. The storm was fully overhead now, with rain hammering against the windshield. Jake flicked the wipers to high, but the rain was so heavy it was almost impossible to see. Then, out of nowhere, his truck's headlights illuminated a massive, rusted sign, "Welcome to Nowhere." Jake hit the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop. The sign was riddled with bullet holes, and the paint had long since peeled away. Behind it was a small town, or what was left of one. The buildings were dilapidated, their windows shattered, and roofs caved in. The only light came from a single flickering street lamp. Against his better judgment, Jake pulled into the town. He needed to find someone, anyone, who could tell him where he was. Parking his truck near what looked like an old diner, he grabbed his flashlight and stepped out into the rain. The diner's door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Tables and chairs were overturned, and a layer of dust covered everything. Jake's flashlight swept across the room, landing on a counter where a bell sat. Ding. Jake jumped at the sound. He hadn't touched the bell yet it rang. His flashlight flickered, and for a moment, he thought he saw a shadow move across the far wall. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the empty diner. No answer. Jake backed out of the diner, his instincts screaming at him to leave. As he turned to head back to his truck, he froze. Figures stood in the rain, their shapes barely visible in the dim light. They surrounded the truck, unmoving. "Hey, what do you want?" Jake shouted, but the figures didn't respond. They simply stood there, watching him. He ran toward the truck, clutching his flashlight like a weapon. But as he got closer, the figures dissolved into the rain, leaving no trace they had been there. Jake climbed into the cab, locking the doors and starting the engine. The truck roared to life, but the headlights flickered and dimmed. Jake slammed his fists on the steering wheel. "Come on, not n-" Suddenly, the radio crackled back to life. A chilling voice whispered, "Turn back, before it's too late." Jake didn't need to be told twice. He threw the truck into reverse, but the tires spun uselessly. He was stuck. The storm intensified, and the sound of pounding rain was joined by something else, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all around him. Then he saw it. In the rearview mirror, a massive shadow loomed. It was an amorphous, writhing thing, its edges flickering like smoke. Eyes, hundreds of them, opened along its surface, glowing with an unnatural light. Jake's blood ran cold. He threw the truck into drive, slamming on the gas. The tires caught, and the truck lurched forward, barreling out of the town and back onto the highway. But the shadow followed, its growls growing louder, its many eyes locked on him. The road twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense, looping back on itself. No matter how fast Jake drove, the shadow stayed close. His headlights illuminated another sign, "Next exit, nowhere, 5 miles." "How is that possible?" Jake shouted, panic clawing at his chest. The distance, tendrils of darkness reaching for the truck. Jake swerved, narrowly avoiding a tree that seemed to spring out of nowhere. His heart pounded as the radio crackled again, the voice screaming, "You can't escape." Jake's vision blurred as the truck hurtled forward. The highway seemed endless, a labyrinth designed to trap him. The shadow engulfed the truck, and Jake screamed as everything went black. Jake woke to the sound of birds chirping. He was slumped over the steering wheel, his truck parked on the side of a familiar road. The sun was rising, casting a warm glow over the landscape. He checked his watch. It was the same time he had started his drive the night before. His cargo was untouched, and there was no sign of the storm, the town, or the shadowy creature. As Jake pulled back onto the highway, a chill ran down his spine. In the rearview mirror, far in the distance, he thought he saw a rusted sign, "Welcome to Nowhere." Jake couldn't shake the eerie feeling that clung to him like the morning mist. Every bump in the road felt like a whisper, and every shadow seemed to stretch too far. The highway, now bathed in sunlight, should have felt comforting, but instead, it felt like it was watching him. He glanced at the rearview mirror again. The rusted, "Welcome to Nowhere" sign was gone. It could have been his imagination, but his gut told him otherwise. "Just a bad dream," he muttered to himself. "Too much coffee and too little sleep." The road ahead seemed normal enough, stretching out like a ribbon across the flat landscape. He turned on the radio, hoping to drown out his unease with a bit of music. The static crackled to life again, and this time, it played an old country tune. Jake relaxed a little, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. But then the music began to distort, slowing until it sounded like a record melting under heat. The static returned, and the same chilling voice whispered, "You never left." Jake slammed the radio off, his hands shaking. His heart raced as he scanned the road for signs of anything unusual, but everything looked normal. The same endless stretch of asphalt and the occasional withered tree. Then he saw the mile marker. "That can't be right," Jake said aloud. He had been driving for at least an hour since waking up. He should have passed dozens of mile markers by now. But the sign didn't lie. It was the same one he had seen before the nightmare began. The same cracked paint, the same rust bleeding down its edges. Panic bubbled up in his chest. He pressed harder on the gas, determined to get as far away as possible. The truck roared forward, the scenery blurring past. But no matter how far he drove, the mile marker ahead always read the same, mile 15. Jake's knuckles turned white as he gripped the wheel. His breathing grew shallow. No, this isn't happening. A honking sound broke through his panic. He glanced at the side mirror and saw another truck, an older model, barreling down the highway behind him. Its headlights were blinding, even in the daylight. Finally, someone else, Jake muttered, relief washing over him. He slowed down, waving his arm out the window to signal the other driver. But as the truck pulled up alongside him, Jake's blood ran cold. The cab was empty. The driver's seat was vacant, the wheel turning on its own as the truck kept perfect pace with his. Its windows were cracked, and the paint was faded, as if it had been abandoned for decades. Jake's eyes locked on the passenger window, where a pale handprint was smeared across the glass. The truck suddenly veered closer, forcing Jake to swerve. He struggled to keep control of his rig as the phantom vehicle nudged him toward the shoulder. "Get off me," Jake shouted, slamming his horn. The ghostly truck fell back, its headlights blinking out as it disappeared into thin air. Jake pulled to the side of the road, his chest heaving. He stepped out, needing to catch his breath and convince himself he wasn't losing his mind. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the distant caw of a crow. Jake leaned against the truck, his eyes scanning the horizon. The highway stretched on, empty and unforgiving. Then he heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the back of his truck. Jake froze, his breath hitching. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like knuckles rapping against metal. Grabbing a tire iron from the cab, his hands trembled as he approached the trailer. The tapping stopped. Jake hesitated, then flung open the trailer doors. His flashlight illuminated rows of tightly secured crates, all perfectly in place. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But as he turned to close the doors, he saw her, the woman from the road, standing just a few feet away. Her dress clung to her rain-soaked frame, and her glowing eyes pierced through him. "You didn't listen," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Jake stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. "What do you want from me?" "To warn you," she replied, stepping closer. "This road, it doesn't end. Not for you." Jake shook his head, his back pressing against the trailer. "I just want to leave. Tell me how to leave." The woman tilted her head, a sorrowful expression crossing her face. "You can't leave what you've already become." "What does that mean?" Jake demanded, but she was gone before he could get an answer. He climbed back into the truck, slamming the doors behind him. His hands shook as he started the engine, his mind racing. What did she mean? What had he become? As the truck rumbled back onto the highway, Jake noticed the sky had changed. The sun was gone, replaced by a pale, sickly light that cast no shadows. The air grew colder, and the road began to twist in impossible ways, curves and loops that defied logic. Signs appeared along the roadside, their messages growing more sinister with each mile. "Turn back. This is your home now. The road owns you." Jake's panic turned to desperation. He floored the gas, the truck hurtling down the endless stretch of cursed highway. The radio crackled to life again, but this time it wasn't a voice. It was laughter, low, guttural, and mocking. In the distance, a figure stood in the center of the road. Jake honked the horn, but the figure didn't move. As he got closer, he realized it was himself, an exact replica, standing still with empty eyes and a cruel smile. Jake swerved to avoid it, but the truck spun out, crashing into a ditch. He hit his head against the wheel, the world spinning around him. When he opened his eyes, he was back on the highway. The truck was intact, the engine idling smoothly, but something was different. The air felt heavier, the colors muted. He looked into the rearview mirror and saw the figure again, himself, standing on the road, watching him drive away. Only now, its cruel smile was his own. The realization hit Jake like a freight train. He wasn't escaping. He never would. The highway had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many others before, and now he was part of it, a ghost on the road to nowhere, doomed to haunt the endless stretch of asphalt forever. Jake sat motionless in the cab of his truck, his mind spinning as the reality of his situation sank in. The highway wasn't just a road, it was a trap, a prison for souls like his. He could feel it now, a suffocating presence pressing down on him, as if the road itself was alive and aware. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "I'm not giving up. There's got to be a way out." The truck rumbled as he pressed on the accelerator, forcing it back onto the... He didn't have a plan, but sitting still felt like surrender. The highway stretched ahead, twisting and looping in ways that defied logic, but Jake kept driving, refusing to let fear paralyze him. As the miles passed, strange things began to happen. Shadows darted across the road, their forms shifting and twisting like smoke. The landscape on either side of the highway seemed to warp, the trees bending and swaying as if in a wind Jake couldn't feel. Signs continued to appear, their messages growing more "You're one of us now. There's no way out. Welcome home." Jake ignored them, focusing on the road ahead. His mind raced as he tried to piece together what had happened. The detour, the strange woman, the endless loop of mile 15, none of it made sense. But one thing was clear, he was trapped in something far beyond his understanding. The radio crackled again, and Jake tensed. He reached for the dial to turn it off, but a voice stopped him. "Jake," it was soft, familiar, not the sinister whispers or laughter he'd heard before, but something else, someone he knew. "Dad?" Jake whispered, his throat tightening. "Jake," the voice said again, more clearly this time. "You need to stop." Jake's hands trembled on the wheel. "Stop? Stop what? Driving? What are you talking about?" "Listen to me," the voice urged. "The road isn't real. None of this is real. You're holding on to something that's keeping you here." "What do you mean?" Jake shouted, his frustration boiling over. "I'm trying to get out. Tell me how." The voice was silent for a moment. Then it spoke again, softer this time. "You're holding on to guilt, to pain. You have to let it go." Guilt? Pain? Jake's mind reeled as memories flooded back. His last call with his father before he passed, the argument they'd had, the way he'd ignored his dad's calls in the weeks leading up to it, the regret that had eaten at him ever since. Tears welled in Jake's eyes as the realization hit him. I never said goodbye. I never told you I was sorry. That's why you're here, Jake," the voice said gently. "The highway feeds on what you can't let go. It keeps you trapped. If you want to escape, you have to forgive yourself." Jake gripped the wheel, his vision blurred by tears. Could it really be that simple? Could letting go of his guilt free him from this nightmare? The radio went silent, and Jake's truck began to slow on its own. The landscape around him shimmered, the warped trees and shifting shadows dissolving into a blinding white light. For a moment, Jake felt weightless, as if he were floating. When the light faded, he found himself parked on the shoulder of a familiar road. The sun was rising, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange. The highway was normal again. No cracks, no twisting loops, no ominous signs. Jake stepped out of the truck, the cool morning air filling his lungs. Birds chirped in the distance, and the world felt alive again. He glanced at the horizon, where the road stretched out like a promise of freedom. He looked back at the cab of his truck, where his father's old hat sat on the passenger seat. Jake picked it up, running his fingers over the worn fabric. A small smile tugged at his lips. "Thanks, Dad," he whispered. Climbing back into the truck, Jake started the engine and pulled onto the highway. This time, the road felt different, open, inviting. The weight on his chest was gone, replaced by a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. As he drove, he passed a sign that made him chuckle. Next exit, freedom, 15 miles for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Jake believed it. Jake kept driving, the rhythmic hum of his truck's tires on the smooth highway easing his nerves. The road felt real now, solid beneath him, and the morning sun was a warm reassurance that he had escaped whatever nightmare had ensnared him. But deep down, a small seed of doubt lingered. Was it really over? The miles passed uneventfully. Jake tried to keep his mind focused on the open road, but the silence of the cab seemed louder now. He glanced over at his father's hat on the passenger seat, a bittersweet smile playing on his lips. It was a symbol of closure, of the forgiveness he had finally granted him. Yet, as the truck climbed a gentle hill, Jake noticed something strange. The horizon seemed wrong. It shimmered faintly, like heat waves rising off asphalt. And then, as he crested the hill, his stomach dropped. The highway ahead wasn't the open, familiar path he expected. Instead, it was empty, completely void of any scenery. The land beyond the road dissolved into an endless gray void stretching out in every direction. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, slowing the truck to a crawl. He leaned forward, squinting at the eerie expanse. The road continued into the void, disappearing into the distance, but there were no trees, no sky, no sun. Even the warmth of the morning light had vanished, replaced by a dull, colorless haze. Jake stopped the truck, his heart pounding. He opened the door and stepped out onto the pavement. The air was heavy and still, and the silence was deafening. "Hello?" he called out, his voice swallowed by the oppressive quiet. A faint sound answered, a whisper carried on the non-existent wind. Jake turned, scanning the horizon, but there was nothing. The whisper grew louder, and then he recognized it. His own voice. You're one of us now." Jake's chest tightened as he stumbled backward, his boots scraping against the pavement. The voice echoed around him, growing louder with each repetition. "One of us now. One of us now." "No!" Jake shouted, clamping his hands over his ears. "I got out. I forgave myself. This isn't." The ground beneath him trembled, cracks spidering across the pavement. Jake scrambled back into the truck, slamming the door shut. The engine roared to life, and he floored the gas pedal, desperate to outrun whatever was happening. The truck barreled down the highway, the void swallowing the scenery around him. The road stretched endlessly, the same gray emptiness pressing in from all sides. The cracks in the pavement followed him, growing wider, threatening to consume the truck. Jake gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. "This isn't real. This isn't real." The radio crackled again, and this time it wasn't his father's voice. It was something darker, colder. "You didn't really believe you could leave, did you?" The voice sneered. Jake's breath hitched. "I forgave myself. I let go. Did you?" The voice taunted. "Or did you just tell yourself what you wanted to hear?" Lights flickered, and for a moment, Jake saw them again. The shadows, the glowing eyes, the figure that looked like him standing in the road. They were all waiting, as if they had never left. Jake clenched his teeth, his grip on the wheel tightening. "No, you don't control me. You don't own me." The laughter returned, deep and guttural, vibrating through the truck. The voice whispered, almost lovingly, "Oh, Jake, you were never driving. You've always been the passenger." The road ahead twisted, spiraling into a vortex of light and darkness. The truck was pulled forward, unstoppable, the cab shaking violently as Jake fought to stay in control. The laughter grew deafening, and Jake's vision blurred. Then, everything went silent. Jake woke to the sound of an engine idling. His eyes fluttered open, and he found himself sitting in the cab of his truck, parked on the side of a familiar road. The morning sun was rising, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and orange. He blinked, disoriented. Everything seemed normal. The air was crisp. The birds were chirping. He glanced at the passenger seat. His father's hat was still there. But when he looked into the rearview mirror, his heart sank. Far in the distance, standing in the middle of the road, was a figure. It was himself, staring back with empty, glowing eyes. Jake tore his gaze away, his hands trembling on the wheel. The highway stretched ahead, endless and inviting. But as he put the truck in gear and drove forward, he couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how far he went, the figure would always be waiting. And deep in his heart, he knew the truth. The highway would never let him go. Jason was a truck driver who loved the freedom of the open road. He worked long hours, hauling goods across the country, and he took pride in always making his deliveries on time. But one cold November night, Jason took a shortcut that changed his life forever. The highway was quiet as Jason steered his truck onto Route 66, a stretch of road he'd never driven before. His GPS showed it would save him 2 hours, and with deadlines to meet, he couldn't resist. The sign at the entrance read, Route 66, next exit 100 miles. Jason shrugged and turned onto the highway, confident that the shortcut would be smooth sailing. The first hour passed uneventfully. The road was straight, flanked by dark woods on either side. Jason turned on the radio to keep himself awake, but all he got was static. He frowned and switched it off. The silence in the cab felt heavier than usual. About 15 minutes later, Jason noticed something. He'd been driving for what felt like miles, but he hadn't seen another car, a gas station, or even a mile marker. The woods seemed endless, their gnarled branches reaching out like claws. Then he spotted a light up ahead. Relieved, he slowed down as his truck approached a diner on the side of the road. Its neon sign flickered. Betty's Diner, open 24/7. The parking lot was empty, except for an old, rusted car. Jason stepped inside. The air smelled like burnt coffee and grease. A lone waitress stood behind the counter, wiping it with a rag. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice flat. Jason nodded. "Sure. And maybe directions. I think I'm lost." The waitress didn't answer. She poured him a cup of coffee and set it down. Jason noticed her hands were shaking. "You okay?" he asked. She looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "What do you mean?" Jason asked. But before she could answer, the lights in the diner flickered. The room grew colder, and a low rumble echoed from outside. Jason turned toward the window. His truck, parked in the lot, was shaking as if something massive was walking nearby. But there was nothing there, just the dark woods and the empty road. "Leave," the waitress said urgently. "Get back in your truck and don't stop for anything, no matter what you see." Jason didn't wait to ask questions. He threw a few dollars on the counter, ran outside, and climbed into his truck. His heart pounded as he started the engine and sped back onto the highway. Jason drove for miles, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The diner disappeared into the distance, but the road ahead looked the same, straight, empty, and surrounded by endless trees. Then he saw something that made his blood run cold. Up ahead, the diner reappeared. The same flickering neon sign, the same empty parking lot, the same rusted car. Jason slammed on the brakes, his truck skidding to a stop. "That's impossible," he muttered. He'd been driving straight the whole time. There was no way he'd turned around. He pulled over and checked his GPS. The screen was frozen, the map showing nothing but a blank grid. His phone had no signal. Jason's breathing quickened. He decided to keep driving. "It's just a trick of the road," he told himself. "A weird loop. I'll get out of here if I keep going." He pressed on, gripping the wheel tightly. The miles blurred together, the trees merging into a dark wall on either side. But after what felt like hours, the diner appeared again. This time, the neon sign was off, and the rusted car had disappeared. Jason's hands shook as he drove past without stopping. He didn't dare look at the windows of the diner. He had the awful feeling someone or something was watching him. Jason kept driving, his eyes glued to the road. The night seemed endless, the moon frozen in place. His fuel gauge dipped lower, and he realized he hadn't seen a gas station in hours. Then he heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the back of the cab. Jason froze. He knew he was alone. He hadn't picked up anyone, and his truck was locked. He turned the radio back on, hoping to drown out the noise, but all he got was static. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like knuckles rapping against the metal walls of the trailer. Jason's grip on the wheel tightened as he tried to ignore it. "Just the wind," he whispered. "It's nothing." But then a voice came through the static on the radio, soft and chilling. "Why won't you stop?" Jason's stomach lurched. The voice was calm, almost friendly, but it sent a shiver down his spine. He reached for the radio dial to turn it off, but the voice spoke again. "You can't run forever, Jason." His name. The voice knew his name. Jason's hands trembled as he turned the radio off and pressed harder on the gas. The tapping from the back of the truck stopped, but now he felt something worse, a presence in the cab with him. He glanced at the passenger seat and nearly drove off the road. A figure sat there, pale and thin, its face hidden under the shadow of a hood. Its hands rested in its lap, long fingers tipped with jagged nails. "You've been driving for a long time," the figure said, its voice the same one from the radio. "Aren't you tired?" Jason screamed and swerved, the truck veering onto the shoulder. When he looked again, the seat was empty. Jason didn't know how much longer he could go on. His fuel was almost gone, his mind racing with fear. He felt trapped, like the highway itself was alive and toying with him. Then he saw it, a sign ahead, glowing faintly in the darkness. "Last exit, turn back now." Jason didn't think twice. He veered onto the exit ramp, the truck rumbling as it left the endless highway. The ramp twisted and turned, leading him down into a foggy valley. Relief flooded him as he saw lights up ahead, an old gas station with a faded sign that read, "Rest easy." Jason parked and stumbled out of the truck, his legs weak. The station looked abandoned, but he didn't care. He just needed to stop, to breathe. As he stepped inside, he froze. The diner waitress stood behind the counter, her hollow eyes staring at him. Behind her, the neon sign flickered. Betty's Diner, open 4/7. Jason turned to run, but the door was gone. The walls of the gas station stretched endlessly, trapping him inside. The waitress stepped closer, her voice echoing as she said, "You didn't listen. You'll never leave." The lights flickered, and the darkness swallowed Jason whole. Weeks later, another trucker pulled onto Route 66, eager to save time. He passed a rusted truck parked at the side of the road, its cab empty. The trucker glanced at the diner up ahead, its neon sign flickering in the night. Betty's Diner, open 4/7. He thought about stopping but decided to keep driving.